Let's see where we left off. Alright, the last time we met, looks like it was about we talked about Pisa in Italy and going back to Germany and way past that. And you had just put in your application for Air America, and you had met with a gentleman. He had mentioned seeing all the applications of everyone who hadn't been picked. I believe he told you you were in, and you told Kippy, and she was excited, enthusiastic about going, and that's
she
where
was
we
there
left
with
off.
me. She paid for her to come up for the interview and spend the night and our dinner, and
That was in DC?
yeah,
And what year was that, you suppose?
1966. I think it was about June of that year, because I still had until the 22nd of August as my obligation for flight school.
Yeah. But they got you out of that altogether, right? They said that's no problem, and
Yep. And when I went before the colonel to tell him I wasn't going to extend, he just said, "Any particular reason?" After 12 years service, I said, "No." And you go to work overseas, and okay, and he just signed it off. That was it.
so you wouldn't have mentioned Air America at that time. Like, it wasn't well known. Like, even in the military, do you think he would have been aware of the program, and was that common knowledge? Or?
I don't think so. It,
Yeah.
it seemed to be like up Washington D.C. area and Fort Belvoir, and in that area it was common knowledge. And a friend of mine, he went in, actually flew an Army helicopter over to D.C. and parked it on the pad outside of the Department of Army there, and went in, interviewed, and they said, "Okay, you're hired, and you're out of the Army."
That smooth of a transition? Yeah.
He says, "Well, I got a helicopter out there. I think I have to return it."
Double parked out on the back.
So they said, "Okay, we'll just fly it back, and you're hired, and send us your passports, and we'll get all the visas and everything." And he was out of the Army that day.
That's amazing. And then, so was there a period of time getting ready to go and packing up the family? That all happened fairly quickly as well?
Well, in my case, I still had from June until August to serve, so we had time to get everything packed up. We were living in a mobile home, so got the kids and Kippy their passport, and they got all their shots that were, required to go overseas at that time.
2 kids at this point?
Yeah. Lisa and Chris. Chris was 3, Lisa was 4. And it took maybe just a couple of weeks for to get the passports, to get all the visas and everything. And I went over, I left September 15th by way of Seattle and Tokyo, and ended up in Taiwan, Taipei, and spent a week there in processing and getting my Air America uniforms. And they, impressed upon us the fact that we didn't need to talk about the company and what we did. and that we had allowance of 1,500 pounds that they would ship over to Saigon. And I don't recall now if we shipped anything over or not. It didn't seem like there was any reason to. They had, fully equipped kitchens and everything like that overseas. So we saved that, I think, for when I transferred up to Udorn years later, 4 years later.
And you shipped some things over then at that point?
Yeah, at that time we decided to build a house up in Udorn, so we shipped over double door refrigerator and gas range and freezer, different items for the kitchen, which was quite needed. But in Saigon, I left Taipei after a week. I went to Hong Kong and they flew us on the Mandarin jet, which was a civil air transport I don't know if it was a Douglas 880 but it was large 4-engine jet equivalent to a Boeing 707, but it was the fastest 4-engine transport at that time. And we rode in first class and had the stewardesses served meals on linen with silverware and wine, and everything was nicely done. And of course, they brought you, first of all, a cloth, damp, hot cloth so you could wash your face and get ready to eat. And then afterwards, they did the same and brought a cloth for you to wash your hands off and make sure you didn't spill anything. They had after dinner drinks. It was all nicely done. The crews were all Chinese, except for the pilots. They were American pilots, but all the stewardesses were, I guess there were a few Japanese, but for the majority they were Chinese. We went from Hong Kong to Bangkok, and I was in Bangkok for 2 weeks for the ground school and indoctrination and everything. And then left Bangkok and flew on Air Vietnam to Saigon, and arrived in Saigon, I think like October 15th, just about a month after I left the States. At that time, I didn't have Kippy and the kids with me. They were still back in Fort Lauderdale with her parents. So I had to set about finding a place for us, and started flying just about immediately. Went out and did a check ride and then started flying. And I had been stationed down in the Delta when I was there in the military. So as it worked out, my first 2 weeks that I flew out of Saigon was down in the Delta, which had changed completely, and I was always the wingman for section leader or the platoon leader, so I never had a map. I had no idea where we were in South Vietnam was all I knew. And got down to the Delta. This was October of '66, and the entire Delta was underwater. It was all flooded. So we operated from Canto, which was above water, but just barely. And then we'd fly up to Mokwa, and they had built a big platform, big enough to support the helicopter, and we would land on top of that platform, and the fuel truck could drive out through the water and would stay running, and the truck would refuel us, and it would take off and deliver rice or personnel, whatever they had for us to do.
What were you flying?
A Huey,
You were flying
B-model Hueys. We had 5, what they called a Kawasaki Bell, because it was manufactured by Bell but assembled in Japan at the Kawasaki plant. And then we had 5 that were from the States, but they were kind of they weren't the standard B-model Huey. We had a D-model rotor system, which was 48 feet instead of 44, and we had a slightly more powerful engine. So a lot of times when we were flying around the American troops, we would land and take off vertically, which they couldn't do because they didn't have power, just to show off.
Yeah. They'd have to get a bit of a running start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in December, Kippy and the girls arrived in Saigon. I had secured a 2-bedroom, like a little apartment in Saigon, and I picked them up at Tonsanut, and it was about 110 degrees, and she got off the TWA 740 or 707 in a pink wool dress with white gloves and a little white hat. And the girls had matching, dresses, which they hated, but they all got off, and she was sweating profusely by the time we got through customs and immigration, and they checked their shots and all that stuff.
You suppose she was wondering if she made a horrible mistake at that
Yeah,
point?
she was starting to have doubts about her clothing choices. But the very first night we settled in, and I had got a bunch of piasters to pay for our new place that we were going to move to. The one we were going to was just short term. So we had like 150,000 piasters, and Kippy had brought over a little miniature schnauzer puppy. So Butch, we put him downstairs for the night, and about 1 in the morning he just started barking like crazy, so I went down to see what was going on, and I couldn't see anything wrong, but I noticed that the curtain on the front door was blowing just a little bit. And it was a big glass front door, and the cowboys, the crooks, they called them cowboys, they'd come up and they'd taken the glass out of that front door so they could get in without breaking the window or anything. And the dog saved us a lot of money that night.
Yeah.
So I was able to replace it and make sure that they couldn't just come back and take it out. And then about a week later, they stole the dog.
Oh no.
So
Damn
our
it.
little alarm system went away. But we moved from the little 2-bedroom place to a nice big villa style with a big living room, dining room, and had the bedrooms upstairs, had maid quarters downstairs, and we had 2 maids at the time, you know, mainly to clean up and cook. But most of the time Kippy did the cooking, and she kind of liked to do that.
Was this a neighborhood full of expats, or was it a Vietnamese neighborhood?
It was right in the middle of Vietnamese.
Yeah.
The only expats or Americans were just right on the corner from us, basically. The Air Force had a C-123 that they flew for General Westmoreland.
Mm-hmm.
He was in charge of MACV at that time, and it was painted white, so they nicknamed it the White Whale. Their pilots lived just kitty corner from us, so we got to know them quite well. We had a housewarming, and they brought a whole box of steaks that they'd stolen from the general. So we had a really nice party. I didn't realize until we were down to the last few steaks that they were Delmonico's and were very, very good, and I snagged one. But we would have, on the weekend, when generally they were off, we'd have dinner at our house, or they'd have dinner for us over at their house. And that went on for a couple of months, and then Kippy decided to get a little adventurous. So she found a lamb roast downtown in Saigon in the market.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Air Force guys, they didn't eat local food. So she told them that she found this lamb roast and somebody got it for her from the commissary. And at that particular time we were having power outages, so we always had candles ready. And in the middle of dinner with this beautiful lamb roast that she cooked up, the lights went out and one of the pilots bit down and said, "What's that?" And he pulled it out and we lit the candles, and it was an arrowhead from a target arrow. Somebody had shot this poor lamb
Oh no.
in the butt with a target arrow. So kind of shot Kippy's story down, but
The truth came out.
we ate the roast anyhow. It was really good.
And was the house like close to it? Back up. Was Air America in the place that you went to each day on the military base, or was it adjacent to it, or was it?
It was on Tonsnut. We went in I guess it was the south gate of Tonsnut, and just drove right onto the parking area for the ramp. But we didn't really have to have transportation because Air America had Volkswagen minibuses that they came by and they picked us up in the morning and brought us home at night. So, well, most of the guys had motorcycles. Quite a few of the older guys had cars that they paid a lot of money for.
Yeah.
And drove. And it was, the Vietnamese were corrupted pretty much by the French, so they like to, take payment under the table for your license and for your registration and for your driver's license and everything. To expedite things, you kind of slip them a little bit of money. So we had a motorcycle, and I bought a little Honda 90. Never ridden a motorcycle, so I had to learn how to ride it first. And then when Kippy and the kids came, we just all piled on the motorcycle. And we put Kippy behind me on the motorcycle, and she would hold Lisa, and then I put Christine up on the gas tank. And we'd go down into Saigon and shop and whatever. And one day, a couple of years we'd been doing that, and Kippy was pregnant with Tara. So I guess it was 2 years later. But we were riding into Saigon, and Kippy was pregnant, had Lisa on the back and Christine up on the front, and the base manager's wife pulled up alongside at an intersection and hollered at me, and she said, "If I ever see you on that again, you'll be fired." So we went out and procured a car. Didn't quite do it legally, so it didn't have the proper registration, or Kippy didn't even have a driver's license for over in Saigon, which led to a few times where she got stopped and they wanted money to let her go and drive without the registration and license and everything, and she would refuse and act like she didn't know what they were talking about. And one particular time they were downtown Saigon, and they called the Vietnamese police white mice, because they had a uniform that was white tops and gray slacks, I think. And she came out of some store that she was shopping in, had the two girls with her, put them in the back seat, and about the time she's ready to leave, this white mouse came up alongside the car and demanded to see the registration and her license, and so she whipped some French on him, but unfortunately he spoke French. So that pretense didn't work. So she was just about to the point that she was going to drive off, and he pulled his revolver. So now the girls are in the back and they're crying, and they think that their mom's going to get killed right there in front of them. And then some GIs came out and got with the white mouse and, said, "Oh, just, take it easy." And he put his gun away, and they gave him some money, and Kippy drove away. Yeah. And then Lisa from the back, she says, "Mommy, were we going to become angels?"
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, so there were times that it was quite scary. Other times it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But the company was quite lenient with their policy of flying dependents around the country. Like, we flew the helicopters, and occasionally we would reposition a helicopter from Saigon all the way up to Da Nang in Icor. And usually that required that we would find some place in between Saigon and Da Nang to refuel. So I had Kippy, she decided she wanted to go with me on one of these trips that we remained overnight. And she got in the back, and we're flying up about halfway up to Da Nang.
Did she have experience flying in helicopters, or was it all brand new to her?
It was brand new. She'd never ridden on one. But she had the headset on and looked really cute. We landed at a special forces camp that had fuel. They had 55-gallon drums, and we would just hook into it and pump the fuel into the gas tank. And so while she's waiting, she was talking to the guys in the special forces camp, and them how I had been in special forces and this and that. And so they had her over with an M60 machine gun and belts of ammunition back over her shoulder and taking pictures. And then we got up to Da Nang, and usually I would RON, remain overnight for 5 days at a time. So the first day that I was out flying and she didn't have anything to do, she sat around the house and just got really bored. So the next day she had been talking to someone. They told her about China Beach.
Mhm.
And the Marines were out there and they had recreational equipment and sailboats and everything. So she decided she was going to go out to China Beach.
It was a long haul, like, pretty good distance.
It was maybe 5 miles.
Okay.
So she got transportation on a bus or whatever out there. And all these Marines are just goo-goo-eyed because there's a round eye in South Vietnam. So she told them she wanted to learn how to sail one of the sailboats. So naturally somebody jumped up and said, yeah, I'll show you how, come on. So they took her out and she sailed around, and they gave her a checkout as a captain, I guess you'd call it. And so she could go down there anytime she wanted and take a sailboat and sail by herself. But the next day when she got out there, she found out that it was the breeding season for the sea snakes, and that they were all over out there on the ocean, and they would just crawl in the boats with people, and they're very deadly.
Yeah, really poisonous, huh?
Very. So she decided sailing wasn't really her forte and got a ride back into the hostel. But another time we had talked to the Air Force guys who flew for General Westmoreland, and they said, well, we can fly you around the country, you know, and you just have to wear a uniform. So they found these camouflage uniforms that the Vietnamese striker forces wore, and she got a pair that would fit her, and she got one of the floppy hats, and they smuggled her onto the airbase, and she flew around with them. She went down in the Delta, and they were trading the special forces guys for keepsake guns and everything for guys to take back to the States. Then they flew to the Philippines base and traded the Filipinos the guns for San Miguel beer, and then they would fly up to Tay Ninh and to trade the beer for whatever else they were in need of. So she flew around with them all day long, and they had a good time. She was quite adventurous.
Were the girls in like a preschool or something? Was there like a community set up for childcare and socializing and all that?
Well, we had maids. We had 2 maids all the time, and the cook and his wife. So there were plenty of people to keep them occupied. And we had at the first place we didn't have a pool, but at the second place that we got, we had a swimming pool, and the girls learned how to swim, so that kept them busy. And they went to, when they got, I think after a year, they went to the embassy sponsored school, the Phoenix Study Group. The embassy, I guess, supported that. So they went through kindergarten, first grade or whatever there. In fact, I think Lisa just recently said that her preschool or kindergarten teacher had gotten in touch with her through Facebook.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh.
So
That's pretty cool.
Facebook does have some use.
I suppose.
Flying in Vietnam, you know, the people always said, "Oh, you're with CIA." You know, everybody knows that. You know, don't deny it. But I never really saw that as our customer. We flew primarily for the embassy. We flew at these different outposts that we went to. We flew at the direction of the commander of the post, who were generally military. So it was never directly the CIA involvement, except that we flew for the Phoenix group, and that was General Paul Van. He was in charge of that. And unbeknownst to us, it was kind of a black op outfit, and they captured people and got information in some not so nice ways. But other than, you know, flying for them, it was just, okay, you're gonna go over here and you're gonna fly for this guy all day long, whatever he wants. And when like I said, in '66 when I got there, it was flooded, so we were flying mainly 100-kilo sacks of rice, and in some places we couldn't even land because everything was underwater, so they'd have boats kind of tied down to a stake, and we'd have to hover up alongside this boat, which the rotor wash was blowing away from us. We're trying to get it to where we could get it lodged against something and then throw the rice in it. And we never drew any fire from the VC because, I mean, we were supplying rice to everybody indiscriminately, so
Yeah.
never knew who was getting it really.
It's a pretty varied missions from day to day.
Yeah.
Not real repetitive.
No, we didn't have any competition, and the military was there doing their thing, which was based, you know, they were fighting the war, so they didn't really pay any attention to us until we came in and would show off and take off vertically and make them a little envious. But I think the second year we were there, my brother-in-law, he was in Special Forces. He kind of had to go in Special Forces because I was in Special Forces, and my brother-in-law, who was married to my wife's sister, he was also in Special Forces. So the younger brother of Kippy, he had to more or less go into Special Forces. So he had a tour to Vietnam.
What was his name?
James Olin Shuck. And he was the commo sergeant at a little camp down the Delta that was about halfway between Mokwa and Canto. And so when I'd fly by, I'd come up on his frequency and talk to him on the radio and see if he needed anything. And occasionally I'd pick him up and take him into Kanto, which was the big city. You know, it was a little
It was town.
town on the river, but he was able to get stuff and then give him a ride back up to his camp. And then occasionally we'd have parties in Saigon, and I would let him know well in advance so he'd get the time off and pick him up and get him into Saigon to our parties that we would have.
It was a nice break for him to get
Yeah,
nipped out and brought into civilization.
yeah, he got to come in and actually see some of the different things in Saigon that the rest of the GIs never really looked at. We went to the zoo and took the kids and got to meet them and enjoy them.
Saigon was a nice city, right?
It
There
was-
were nice parts to it.
There were nice parts to it. Some parts, you know, after dark, you didn't want to get down there because it wasn't that you were going to get mugged, but quite often the BC were moving through and they would do you bodily harm if they had the opportunity. But for the most part, we lived, probably less than 2 miles from the air base. So when we were out at night, even after curfew at times, we could safely, you know, get back to the house and not have to worry about it.
And during the day, you could pretty much go anywhere that you wanted
Pretty
to.
much, yeah. Yeah, Kippy would take off and she'd go down shopping with the maids, buy the vegetables and whatever, and she'd go into Saigon and shop and ride home in one of those cyclos, they called them.
Like a tuk-tuk, little three-wheeled.
It was the three-wheeled where you rode up front.
Yeah.
The rickshaws, they put you in the back in Hong Kong. The cyclo, they put you up in front and they pedaled it, or they had some that were even motorized.
Yeah.
And you were the bumper. So she would ride them around town. And she, after about 6 months, she kind of got tired of that. So she had been talking to some of the other wives when we go to a party, and they told her, well, you got to come out to the golf course and learn how to play golf. So she talked to me about it, and I said, well, you can learn if you want, but to me that's kind of stupid to hit a little white ball and then spend, you know, your time looking for it. So I went up to Da Nang on RON for 5 days, came back, and there was a note with the maid, and more or less said, you know, come on out to the golf course and we'll have some Chinese noodle soup and a drink or whatever. So I got cleaned up, went out to the golf course, which was just right on the wall, the protective wall of the air base. And they had a nice 18-hole course that they built in there. And I was sitting in the shade, relaxing there, drinking scotch and soda or whatever, and I see my pretty round-eyed wife coming up the 18th fairway with 2 U.S. Air Force colonels, lieutenant colonels, giving her instruction. So I took lessons the next day and the next day, and then started playing golf. Just kind of had to protect my interests there. Yeah, she was very athletic, and so she picked up the game quite easily, but drew a lot of attention.
I bet. You developed an actual love of golf, right? You and Dan play together.
Oh, yeah.
So you overcame your initial
Oh, yeah.
disregard for the sport.
I got to where I really enjoyed it, and then my little brother, he was an athlete at BYU and tore all the ligaments in his knee, so he had to give up his football scholarship and take up golf. So he gave me lessons and showed me how to buy the right equipment and how to use it. So it became a lot of fun. Dan and I enjoyed playing, you know, whenever we could get together, because it was always competition. He'd hit a good shot, and then I'd try and hit it inside him, and he didn't realize I was so competitive. I don't know why, but.
So you arrived in Saigon in '66. In total, how long were you all there?
We stayed in Saigon until January of 1971.
Wow, it's a long time.
So we stayed there until, well, we had an incident where a guy broke in and held us hostage, said he was a VC captain, and robbed us. And Kippy didn't get over that very well, so she had gone over to the chief pilot and his wife. She talked to them, and she was thinking about returning to the States. So I talked to the chief pilot, and we had a station up in Udorn, Thailand, where we flew up into Laos. And I'd been trying to get a change of station and go up there, because we made more money up there. But
Was Udorn the primary Air America hub?
well, for Laos it was.
Yeah.
But Saigon was the primary hub for Vietnam and Cambodia. But after the incident that we got held up, and we had the two girls in the other room when all this happened, so it was pretty scary. And the chief pilot was able to get me a transfer up to Udorn, so Kippy decided she would go up to Udorn with me and the girls
71?
in 71. So we went from basically living in civilized area to Udorn, Thailand, which was just a little village really. They had a couple of hotels and the air base, and not a whole lot more. But my parents, my mother and father, they came over for a visit. We got them discounted tickets, so they came and they spent a month with us up in Thailand. But it was during the season where it was very, very hot, and my mother was overweight, and she just couldn't handle the heat, and we didn't have air conditioning. So after 30 days, she went back to the U.S., to Heber, Utah. And my dad, well, Kippy had one of her trips to the States. She had come up with some house plans for an 8-sided house with a fireplace and a sunken conversation pit that she wanted to get built in Thailand.
Mm-hmm.
So my dad said, well, he would stay there and kind of oversee the construction. So we started that. And of course, the very first day, we went out to the construction site. It was in an American compound. All the houses were American families, and it was built, the homes were built around like a racetrack.
Mhm.
So they were circular. And we were the first house back off of the oval. So we went out to the construction site and the truck pulled up and had these huge logs from these big trees, about 3 or 4 of them that were all chained together. They had the wheels, the back wheels were chained to the logs. There was nothing in between the back wheels and the truck, the semi. So the guy got out and he proceeds to undo the chains, and these logs tumble down onto the ground. And they're about 100 yards away, and I'm thinking, that's cool. That is really cool, but how do we get those logs to the construction site here? Out of the woods, I swear to God, was an Asian elephant with a guy on top. They came over and that elephant moved those logs over the construction site. I had no idea that there was anywhere in the fencing that they could even get the elephant through, because we had fence all the way around the compound. But the elephant got the logs and using its tusks and trunk moved them all over, and then the construction crew, they found ways to cut them up into planks. And then we got a bunch more that had already been cut at a sawmill rather, excuse me. And they used those, they called them Maidang. They were like not redwood, but they were fresh cut and they had a lot of sap in them. So they weren't sanded down in any way, and the sap was still running even. But I found out later that that was the only way they could work with the wood, because when it dried out, it was like ironwood. You
Really
couldn't even
hard.
drive a nail in it. You had to drill a hole to put a nail in. Really hard stuff. But they started construction. They had the concrete pad and the sunken conversation pit and the very basic outline of the fireplace. And my dad had himself a little Thai English dictionary, and the little foreman was, his name was Lek, which means little, and he would come up to my dad and ask him questions in his broken English and Thai, and my dad would translate it and then give him an answer back in English or Thai, whatever. But they worked it out until one day in the construction, they had the cinder block walls pretty well started, and the little foreman came up to my dad and he said, "Grandpa Bill, what's a fireplace?" Never seen a fireplace, had no idea what it was used for or anything. So my dad had to go through hand gestures and everything else to make him understand that it was to heat the house. And because of the 8 sides and the windows and everything, we could light the fireplace and the heat would be spread throughout the whole house. At least that was the theory. So he thought that was pretty cool. And they had part of the mantle, not the mantle, but inside the flue, there was a steel plate that was certain dimensions, And this little guy would not accept anything less than perfection. He had it made downtown and it had to be exactly perfect so that the furnace would draw properly and the smoke would go out the chimney instead of in the house. But they got going, and every day I would come back from flying up country and ride out to the compound and check and see what construction was going on and what materials they would need, and my dad would order the materials and get them delivered. And they were, I mean, we had at times, I think, as many as 50 workers.
Wow.
And they were all over the place. They were like ants, putting stuff up here and over here.
Any idea where the cinder block came from? Is there a block plant
They
in
had
the
a
area?
plant, yeah, they had a plant that some American got started. I'm not sure if he was able to own it outright, but he put up the money and got it started. In fact, I think it was one of the Air America pilots. And we used a lot of cinder block,
Yeah.
and a lot of wood, and a lot of cement. And then when they got to the house shingles, they used a lot of those because they would take a great big lag bolt and hold it and then drive it with a hammer through the tile into the wood.
Yeah.
Which my dad's, he watched that and said, we're breaking too many tiles here. We gotta figure some way to get them to just use a wrench. It had a slot in the top of the lag bolt, so you could use a screwdriver. So we've got a big screwdriver, and he's showing them how to take the screwdriver and use it to turn and put the lag bolt into the wood. They thought he was crazy, but they said, okay. And we went in town. We had to get some more cement. I think we were building a runway off in the woods somewhere. But we came back, and they were up on the roof, and they were putting the lag bolts into the tile. One guy was holding the screwdriver into the slot, and the other guy was banging the top of the screwdriver. They said, we're breaking a lot more tiles. So we said, okay, you just, do it your way. And finally they got to a point where they were going to put the rock facing on the fireplace. And it was cinder block all the way up through the roof. And I came back from up country, and it was just before dark, and the truck was just leaving that had come in and dumped a whole truckload of rock in my sunken conversation pit. And they were large pieces, so the guy who was doing the masonry would take his hammer and he'd make these the proper size to fit in wherever the piece was needed on the facing for the fireplace.
Kind of chisel it off to fit like a puzzle.
Yeah, and I got there just after a big piece fell and smacked him on the top of his foot, and it was all bloody, and oh Lord, I'm gonna have to pay for this for the rest of my life. But it wasn't bad. He just put some cloth on it and went back to work, and the foreman came up to me and he said, Mr. Ben, how do you get the rock to stick in place? So, having discussed this with my father already, I told him, well, when you're putting the cinder block in, you use wire in between the blocks in the mortar, and it holds the rock in place until everything dries, and then you just come through and cut the wires off. Man, I was the smartest guy in the world. I mean, I was
Revolutionized
Einstein
stone.
incarnate. But the house was just about built by November of that year. And,
Still 71?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and my dad had been over there now for just about 6 months, so his visa was getting ready to expire, and Grandma was tired of living by herself, so she told him to get his fanny home. So as a present for staying there and helping us do the construction, I told my dad I would take him down to New Zealand to go fishing for trout down there, because that was his dream his whole life.
Fly fishing?
Just fishing, whatever, you know, whatever they did down there. So
Yeah.
I told Kippy that I was gonna give my dad that as a present, and we were gonna go to New Zealand and go fishing, and he said, well, I'm coming. Well, I'll take you next time. She didn't fall for that. So we left on the night train down to Bangkok, and then got on a flight from Bangkok to Hong Kong, bought a nice camera to take pictures, and then flew to Singapore, and then from Singapore to Australia, into Sydney. There we decided we were going to sightsee instead of going directly over to New Zealand. So we rented a car and drove down the coast, and surfing is the big thing when you drive down the coast of Australia there, and all these guys with long hair and just having a blast out there surfing and drinking beer. And so Dad and I had to stop, you know, at a few places and sample the local brew, because you never know, you might find something you really like.
That's right.
And so we drove down the coast the first day, and then spent the night, and then the next day we drove over to the new capital they were building in Canberra.
Yeah.
And it was still in the stages of just getting the roads and everything down, and went into some little village and found a bowling tournament.
Mm.
And it was really neat. They had everyone in white uniforms.
Seems like they're playing bocce ball or something.
And, yeah, and they would bowl with these bowling balls. And so we spent probably 2 or 3 hours there watching them bowl and drinking beer, and then we drove on into Sydney, spent the night, and then the next morning we flew into the North Island, Auckland. And then in Auckland we rented a car and we drove down the center of the North Island down to Lake Taupo,
Mm-hmm.
and there we set up camp and decided that's where we're gonna go fishing. So the very first day we get out there and we find a guy with a boat who's gonna show us how to catch fish, and it was one of the jet boats with the engine, inboard engine, and used water jet to
Yeah.
go up the rivers. So he took us up the rivers and we had a good time doing that, and then got back down to the lake, and set up the rigs. I don't remember even whether it was spoons or whatever the bait was, but Kippy decided, well, this is getting boring, so she's got her pole in the water, but she's reading a book, so naturally she caught the first fish. Then my dad finally caught a couple of nice ones that we decided to keep and took them to the apartment that we were renting. And in New Zealand, their dining hours are very limited. They're not used to tourists and stuff like that. This was 1972. So they had a few restaurants, but the majority of them closed at like 8 o'clock in the evening.
It was probably 5 to 8 or something,
Yeah.
the dining hours.
So you either got in there and ate when they were open, or you fended for yourself. So Kippy decided she was going to fix a fish dinner for us. And her father in Fort Lauderdale had fixed some king mackerel, where he put them in a brown paper bag and put this onions and salt and pepper or whatever, and put them in the oven and cooked them that way. Well, she was kind of on that line of cooking the fish, but she decided to wrap them in newspaper first. So she put all the ingredients inside the fish and then rolled them up and wrapped them up real good in newspaper. Then she put them in the brown paper bag and put them in the oven. We took off for, I guess about 2.5 hours, and we're out looking around, shopping and stuff. We came back about, 6 o'clock, and we're all set for a cooked fish dinner. They were still raw.
Oh, really?
I mean, they were so insulated by
Yeah.
the newspaper and everything, they didn't cook at all. So now we had to scout around and find some place where we could get something to eat. And we barely made it in to a restaurant and had got some food that night. So Kippy couldn't take the smell of fish in the house, so she put them out on the back porch. Next morning we came out, they were just bones. The cats had got in
Picked and
and
clean.
eaten every bit of the fish, which turned out to be a good deal. I guess at least it wasn't wasted. So we spent quite, a good deal of our time there. We went to the fair, and they had sheep,
A lot of sheep in New
a
Zealand.
lot of sheep.
Yeah.
In fact, that was the first thing we noticed. My dad was a sheep herder from way back. His whole family had
In
sheep
Utah.
in Utah.
That's right.
So he knew all the different breeds and what they were used for. And we are driving down the road from Auckland the very first day, and that's the first thing we noticed in the fields. They were like 10-acre plots, and they would put the pigs and the goat, or not goats, but the sheep and the cows and the horses in one plot, and then when they ate it down, they just moved them over to the next plot, and this one would grow back, and then they would move them from this one back over.
Yeah.
So it was pretty neat the way they managed the feeding the livestock. And every mailbox that was out by the road had a goat on a long rope that would eat the grass all around the mailbox so the mailman could get to the mailbox.
Clever. Those Kiwis are pretty sharp. We spent
Yeah.
a good bit of time down there.
Yeah, we had a good time and went to the fair, and my dad naturally would show us, okay, now this black-headed sheep here, he knew all the names and everything, and says they're kind of aggressive, they'll butt you, and if you're not looking, they'll put you right on your nose. So he said, and these over here they used mainly for mutton, and then these they used for shearing to get the wool. And then they had a shearing contest, and the guys would get in there and they'd shear the sheep, but they had the electric shears. My dad, I remember when I was just a kid, he would shear the sheep with the hand clippers. And a lot of times those sheep came out
A little bit bloody, huh?
yeah, a little bloody and worse for the wear, but while we were there, they had big shops where they made coats, and I wanted a sheepskin coat, so I bought a real nice sheepskin coat that had the suede, brown suede on the outside, looked like Magnum. And unbeknownst to my dad, I bought him a sheepskin coat also, but it was the rough out with the wool on the inside. And when we got ready to leave, we had to go back to Udorn, and he had a ticket from Auckland to Tahiti and then Los Angeles, and he was on standby. So we bought him 2 bottles of scotch, presented him with the coat, and told him, okay, if you get bumped in Tahiti and have to spend the night or whatever, you can just sleep on the beach and use this as a cushion, and you got the scotch to drink, so you should be fine. But he didn't get bumped. He made it all the way back to Utah, and when he arrived in Salt Lake City, it was snowing like crazy, so he had this nice big sheepskin coat to wear. Worked out well.
You guys flew back to Udon?
We flew back into Singapore, and this guy sitting behind us started a conversation and started Kippy drinking wine. And she wasn't a very good traveler, so it worked out quite well, because by the time we got to Singapore, she was singing and carrying on and just having a good time, enjoyed the flight. Then we flew to Bangkok and got the train back up to Udorn, and I went back to work.
Yeah.
The house was, well, pretty much finished by then. We had screens, I think, to put into the windows, but it turned off cold, so we had an opportunity to light up the fireplace. And part of the construction of the house was where the roof beams met. We had 20-inch by 20-inch beams that were in a compression while the construction had them all pushing against each other, and lagged bolts and great big steel
Ringing it all
beams,
together.
yeah. And so it held it all together, and then that supported the weight of the roof from the outer wall, because the roof line just followed it up to the compression ring. So we had pieces of those logs that the guys had cut for the measurement, and they were left over. So I put a couple in the fireplace and then put some scrap on top. And there's so much sap in the beams that when I got the wood burning, the scraps of wood, the 20-inch logs were already burning. And when they finished burning, I mean, they were down to nothing. They
Yeah.
burned down to white ash, and that was it. But worked as advertised, and it heated. The backside was facing the girls' bedrooms, so that worked well because the heat radiated through the back and heated their rooms, and then the front was heated from the fireplace front.
And it gets pretty cold up in northern Thailand, right? Up in the hills, you're pretty good elevation.
Yeah, it does, and a lot of people didn't realize that, and that's why the foreman was so surprised that, you know, there was even such a thing as a fireplace. He'd never seen one. But then after we built ours, another Air America pilot built his house in the same compound, and he came up with his own version of a fireplace, and it kind of caught on. But when it was cold, we had the fireplace, and then when it was hot, we didn't have air conditioning, but generally there was always a little bit of breeze, so we could open up windows on one side and get the other side opened up and get some circulation through. And then everybody smoked at the time, so on the top of the roof was a little cupola where we had windows all the way around, and I had a long piece of bamboo that I could reach up, and they were on chains, so I'd just unlatch it and it would open, and then the air would rise and smoke and everything would go out.
Yeah.
That worked quite well also.
Like what the bars had, after a while, it would suck the smoke out.
Yeah.
So just jumping ahead a bit, you built the house, and all these other families did. When you left, and it was time to go, were you able to sell the homes, or what happened to?
Well, I
to
was up country flying, and we got word was relayed through the radio. The house had caught on fire.
Oh, really?
And Kippy, she just opened up one of the big windows, and everybody went out the window rather than, you know, trying to open up a doorway. So she got the kids all out, and she managed to grab some of our important documents like birth certificates and stuff like that we had in the drawer. And then she was going to go back in. Well, it was burning pretty good, and the dog tripped her. Whether he did it intentionally to keep her from going back in or not, we don't know, but she wasn't able to go back in and get some more stuff out. And the fire department came out from the air base, and about the time they drove up, I had a 45 that I'd stashed in the, probably thinking about the robbery we went through in Saigon. I had a 45 and clip of ammunition in our bathroom. I had stashed up out of the way, and the fire arrived at the gun about the same time the fire department arrived. And so when the 45 rounds started going off, they backed off and they wouldn't get close, so they just sat there and watched it burn. And the next day I got the call, I was up country, and they told me that there'd been a fire and everybody was okay, but that the house had burned down. So I got relieved later that day, and I went back to Udorn. And walking through, after, I don't know, after fire, I guess you just don't remember properly everything that you have.
Yeah.
I know I'd bought an upright piano like this one for Kippy. She didn't play the piano, but she wanted a piano, so I bought her a piano. That piano, it burned down to nothing really, just some ash. But it was like 2 or maybe 3 days later when we had the insurance inspector come and check the damage and everything. We walked all through the house, and I didn't remember that damn piano had been right there until like the next day. It didn't make any difference. It wasn't something that, you know, had a monetary difference in the claims. So
Yeah.
we got the insurance for the house, and then, 3 months later, they started going through the process of closing down our operation in Laos. And
73?
yes, well, 74,
74.
yeah. So when they started shutting down the Udorn station, I had 8 years seniority, so we went back to Saigon, and I took Kippy and all the kids now, including Dan, who was just a baby. But we went back to Saigon, and like the very first day, we were staying in a hotel, and it was a totally different place. I mean, the atmosphere, and people were driving around on motorcycles, and if they found a crowd, they'd throw a hand grenade into it.
It was a powder keg, huh? Everything
Yeah.
was coming to a head.
It wasn't safe at all, so I sent Kippy and the kids back to the States. That was May or June, I think. And then Kippy had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and she was having female issues, so she went to the doctor, and he suggested that since we didn't really want to have any more children, she had her boy by then, Dan, so he suggested that she have a hysterectomy, which looking back was probably, not a very good thing, but she agreed, and I went back on leave for her operation to have the hysterectomy. And when I left Saigon to go back, I had bought the 2 pictures that are on the wall, the wooden plaque-like things that are they're all lacquered and then carved and then painted inside the carving, and they were fairly heavy, so I decided to take them back to Utah.
That's where Kippy and the kids went? It was back to Utah, not Lauderdale?
Yeah, she was going to have the operation in Salt Lake City. Excuse me. So I wrapped them up to protect them and put the padding in between the 2 with the paintings facing each other. And they weighed about 40 pounds, so it wasn't an easy carry-on,
Mm-hmm.
but I was an airline captain, so I had the ID card and got special privileges and flew to Hong Kong, and they allowed me to put the pictures in the where they put the clothing up near the door of the aircraft in like a little closet up there that they had to hang up guy's jacket or whatever when they got on. And when I left Hong Kong, I was on a 747, so same deal. Put them in the storage closet up front, no problem. But the 747, as we taxied out for takeoff, number one engine wouldn't fire up. So we sat at the end of the runway for, probably 10, 15 minutes while they tried to get the engine to start, and it wouldn't. So they pulled back into the terminal, and I got the pictures, and when I went to get on the different 747, they said, oh, you can't put those on board. They're too big, too bulky, and you'll have to put them in the baggage. I said, well, they're very, very fragile paintings, and they said, oh, well, we'll make sure that they're well taken care of. So I finally gave in, and we took off from Hong Kong direct to Honolulu. And when we got into Honolulu, there were no paintings. So I got with the baggage people and told them, I said, these things are very priceless to me, and whatever. And we'll find out what happened, where they went. So I got on the airplane and went to Salt Lake from Honolulu, and told Kippy what had happened. So she immediately got on the phone. She's up in the hospital, getting ready to have her operation, and she's talking to customs people in Salt Lake City Airport. She wants to let them know these paintings are somewhere and should be coming into Salt Lake City, and they have to go through customs. So she went through the operation, and immediately the next day she's on the phone again, checking with customs, and then the day after that, we're getting all ready to check her out of the hospital, and the customs inspector called and told her that he had her paintings. So he wanted to bring them to her hospital room so that he could see what they were and why she was making all this big fuss.
Yeah.
So I got down to the hospital right after he showed up with the paintings, and he unwrapped them and everything there, and they were fine. There was no scratches or anything, and he thought they were just really nice, and I didn't have to pay any customs duty on them or anything. But we started into a discussion, and somehow